Hi, my name is Whitney Ho, and for this week's film analysis, we watched Crip Camp. So Crip Camp is a documentary that starts with disabled kids that went to camp together and shared their experiences of what it means to be disabled, what it means to be inclusive, and then they also talked about how much or how little freedom that they had and that they wanted more freedom in the future. So after camp, it showed how several of those kids became active in the fight against discrimination of disabled individuals. It also shared several stories of their everyday lives, so like their college and school experience, their home life, and if they started a family. For the second half of the film, it showed different videos and clips of the protests happening in New York City and California. So two concepts that stood out to me during the film was Camp Janid and then also the protests for the several laws that would abolish discrimination against them. I enjoyed watching the kids' experiences at Camp Janid because it taught me a lot about how life was from the perspective of someone who was disabled. In the film, they would have group discussions where everyone would get together and they would talk about anything. So every day they would have a different topic to talk about. So one of the topics they talked about was their home life, and the kids said that they understand why their parents were overprotective of them, but sometimes it gets to a point where that overprotectiveness was a constant reminder of them being handicapped. They also mentioned that it was difficult to get any privacy since their parents were always caring for them, so they were unable to get any alone time. Later in the film, they said that these daily discussions helped them realize that they could have a better life and that they needed to stick together. So these are pictures from the movie. So this is the movie poster, and then also these are pictures of the the kids at Camp Janid. So for the second half of the film, it focused on the Rehabilitation Act and Section 504. So these were bills that meant that any building or any entity that receives public or federal funding must make their buildings accessible for those with disabilities. So Judy Heumann, and she's in these two pictures right here, she was a counselor at Camp Janid, and after camp she became the president of the Disabled in Action. So Disabled in Action is a civil rights organization that had a goal of ending discrimination against people with disabilities. So the DIA began to protest after President Nixon vetoed the 504 bill, stating that it would be too costly to implement. The DIA would protest by blocking the streets of New York City or going on national television to share their stories to gain more support from the public. Ultimately, the bill was passed, however, nothing was being done to enforce it. That led to a 28-day sit-in protest at the San Francisco HFW building, as well as protests going on in New York and in Washington, D.C. So in the end, with the help of a few congressmen and large support from the public, 504 was finally enforced to the fullest extent, and accessibility quickly began to appear across the nation. So these two pictures are Judy Heumann, and then these two pictures down here are from the protest happening in San Francisco, and this one is the sit-in protest at the San Francisco building. And then this is another picture of the sit-in protest on the 4th floor, and then this is a picture of the protest happening in Washington. So one of my favorite things in the film was the representation they had. So it showed people of all disabilities, those that were disabled from birth, and then those that became disabled later in life. It did a great job of showing their side of the story and their perspective. So for example, the Jacobsons, they talked about what it was like to start a family and how their child doesn't see them as disabled, but sees them as mom and dad. So this picture right here, these are the Jacobsons. And then this is Diane Jacobson up here. Another thing that I learned from the film was that the DIA received a lot of support from other civil rights organizations. So I know that in the film they talked about how the Black Panther stepped in to help them by supplying them with food and with water and blankets and any other supplies they would need for their protests.